Okay, I've got the recording started. I decided to just do the recordings rather than simulcast because I wasn't getting anyone anyway, and I've got more control over this. Okay, so we're going to start on repeaters. Then there's some coverage of emergency operations, and then we'll get into weak signal propagation, but I don't know if we'll get all the way through that. Some of that gets to be, it needs a little bit more explanation. So we'll see what we do, but repeaters is going to be a real interesting piece for you to learn, because if you're a technician, the way that you're going to get distance is going to be through repeaters. The SARnet is the big repeater network in the state. You can get down to the Keys and up to the Pensacola, up to the Panhandle in Jacksonville. You can talk all the way out of the state on it. And then West Coast Florida has NI4CE, which covers, I think, 11 counties. And it's a strong resource. Both of them are used during hurricane season too. So there's a lot of traffic on both of them when the hurricanes come up. So we'll go ahead and get started on repeaters. And then I posted the links to the study guide. I think it's about 4 or 6 pages. I'm not sure how many pages this one came out to. So I just did an abridged set of notes. The answers are in bold. This one got to be 6, was it 6? Yeah, 6 pages. So, okay. What type of amateur station hang on. Move this over down here. Okay. What type of amateur station simultaneously retransmits the signal of another amateur station on a different channel or channels? And that is a repeater station. Now, what a repeater does, it sits up on a tower somewhere. There's one in Riverview. I think it's up 1,000 feet in Riverview. And it uses an offset channel. It uses 2 frequencies. And when you program your radio to communicate with the repeater, you're programming 2 frequencies. You're programming 1 frequency for transmit, and then the other one for receive. The 2 frequencies differ by a fixed amount depending on what band you're on. It's either 5 megahertz or 600 kilohertz, depending on what frequency band you're in. But they receive and retransmit virtually simultaneously, so quickly that we can say it's simultaneously. So as soon as you start talking, other people are hearing that repeater retransmit your signal. Because that repeater's up 1,000 feet, I've been able to reach it about 30 miles away on a handheld radio. So it greatly extends your range. And if it's a networked repeater system, wherever the other repeaters are, retransmit your signals. So that's why SARnet, if I hit SARnet and I'm talking, it retransmits simultaneously around the state. So repeater station. Now, there are 2 types of repeaters. The most common type of repeater is a duplex repeater. That's what I just described. It has 2 frequencies. It receives on one and then retransmits almost immediately on the second frequency. There is a simplex repeater, though, and that's not really covered in the course, so you don't need to worry about memorizing it. But what a simplex repeater does is it receives and transmits on the same frequency. But because it's using the same frequency, it cannot retransmit until it completes receiving your message. So it actually records your message and then plays it back. So if you're hitting a simplex repeater, you'll key the mic, you'll talk, you'll let off, and then you'll hear your voice come back. So it's kind of odd. I've got a Baofeng DMR radio. It's a Baofeng Tech radio, and it has a repeater function built into it. I also have a small simplex repeater that I picked up for about $100. A full duplex big repeater is going to be about $1,000 or more. So full-blown repeater is expensive, but you can get simplex repeaters that will do something for you. And if you were ever really in a bad, like a bug out situation, you could set up a simplex repeater and extend your range. So anyway, what type of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations? Now there are multiple types. Y'all B, correct. Now the trick to this is to remember, we're talking about repeaters. Repeater's the first one of the answers. It's the only answer that starts off with repeater. An auxiliary station or a space station. Space station being like a small satellite. Amateurs have satellites up in the air that will take your message and then turn around and rebroadcast it a few minutes later. So you can literally hit a satellite from here and then it can retransmit in 10 minutes to wherever it's over. So I've never played with satellites, but it sounds neat. Okay, and then repeater offset. What is meant by repeater offset? Now this is what I was talking about, where you have two slightly off frequencies that a repeater uses, one for receive and one for transmit. So which of these answers sounds right?
A.
A.
A, yep. It's the difference between the repeater's transmit frequency and its receive frequency. All right. And there are standards in the US. Different countries have different standards. We'll get into that in a minute. What is the most common use of reverse split function of a VHF UHF transceiver? Reduce power output, increase power output, listen on a repeater's input frequency, or listen on a repeater's output frequency. And I had to look this one back up yesterday because I couldn't remember it. But it's basically listening on a repeater's input frequency. So what you're doing here is you're flipping the frequencies. There's a reason for it, and we'll get into it in a minute. In fact, this is the answer. Yeah, so basically we're flipping the frequencies. So on your handheld radio, you're listening to what's normally your transmit frequency, and you're transmitting on what's normally your listening frequency. And the reason for that is to see if you can hear something going to the repeater that the repeater's not rebroadcasting. And there are different reasons for that. To trigger a repeater, you have to be able to send some sort of a tone. There are different types of tones you can set, but it's a hidden tone. And you have to program your radio to send that hidden tone. If you don't have it programmed right, the repeater will never trigger. So reverse split's probably something you'd be doing in troubleshooting more than anything. It's not something that you would commonly use. Okay, if a station is not strong enough to keep a repeater's receiver squelch open, which of the following might allow you to receive the station signal? Open the squelch on your radio, listen on the repeater input frequency, listen on the repeater output frequency, or increase your transmit power. Oh, this ties in with the last question we just talked about.
B.
B, correct. Because you're normally, under normal operation, you're listening to the repeater's output frequency. So C doesn't work. A doesn't apply here. Neither does D, because your transmit power's got nothing to do with somebody else's ability to hit that repeater. So what you're doing here is you're trying to hear somebody else talking to the repeater to troubleshoot. Okay, which of the following is a common repeater frequency in the 2-meter band? Plus or minus 5 megahertz, plus or minus 600 kilohertz, plus or minus 500 kilohertz, or plus or minus 1 megahertz. The 2-meter band is a lower frequency than the 70 centimeter band, so the numbers are going to be lower. Do y'all have any idea? And this is one of those memorization questions, so don't worry about it, but it's 600 kilohertz. So the two numbers that you're going to be working with offsets are 5 megahertz, which is the UHF offset, and 600 kilohertz. So those are the two numbers you'll need to remember. And then you'll need to memorize or remember that 600 kilohertz works at the 2 meter band. Okay, and then what's a common frequency? Repeater frequency offset in the 70 centimeter band. And you should get this one right away. Y'all know this one?
5.
I know it's 5
Yeah.
because it's on your sheet.
Yeah, okay, you're cheating. That's all right, that's all right. But yeah, so remember the 2 or 600 kilohertz and 5 megahertz. The 70 centimeter band, those are higher frequencies, so the offset needs to be a larger number. So 5 megahertz versus 600 kilohertz. And the offset would be different. There's also a 1.25 meter band. There's also a 50 meter band, and the offsets are different. They're per band. Now there is a 1.25 meter band. The test doesn't really cover it, so you don't have to worry anything about that. The only thing the test is heavy on is UHF and VHF. And UHF being the 70 centimeter band. Which of the following could the reason you're unable to, which of the following could be the reason you're unable to access the repeater whose output you can hear? You're using an improper transceiver offset. The repeater may require a proper CSS tone from your transceiver. The repeater may require a DCS tone from your transceiver, or all of the above are correct. And the transceiver is your handheld or your mobile radio. So on this one, everything's correct. All of these choices are correct. So we talked about transceiver offset, the 5 megahertz or the 600 kilohertz. So if you don't have it set correctly, that could keep you from being able to trigger the repeater. But the 2 tones, there's a CT-CSS tone and a DCS tone. And those are they're sub-audible tones that are broadcast with your signal, like 60 hertz, 102 hertz, something low. You won't ever hear it, but the repeater will pick it up. And if those tones don't exist, whatever the repeater is programmed for, if you don't match that, it won't trigger the repeater to work. The repeater will just ignore you. Okay. What term describes the sub-audible tone transmitted along with normal voice audio to open the squelch of a receiver? And we just kind of talked about this, but this is a different okay, well, CTC, oh, I'm sorry. DTMF was not one of our options. Let me back up. From that prior question, our options were DCS or CTSS. So that one actually threw me. Our options here, the only one of the options that's correct was the CTCSS. DTMF was not one of our options. It was DCS, and that's not on our list. So again, this is going to be something that you'll have to memorize. These are the different tone frequencies that are allowed. So the repeaters can be programmed for any one of these tone frequencies. And if you don't match it, the repeater won't trigger and repeat your signal. So remember CTCSS. What brief statement indicates you are listening on a repeater and looking for a contact? So basically, what are you doing to tell people that you're on the repeater and that you're available to talk? The words hello test followed by your call sign. Nope, that's not it. Your call sign, and they're referring to your call sign alone. Your repeater, the repeater call sign followed by your call sign, or the letters QSY followed by your call sign. The repeaters do have a reference. I don't know that it's a call sign, but you don't have to rattle off the repeater reference at all. the answer is your call sign. So if you just go on the radio and just say KX4HD, and that's it, you don't say anything else, that identifies you to anyone listening on the repeater. If it's somebody that recognizes you and knows you, then they'll start the conversation. You're just saying, hey guys, I'm here. There's a fellow, I think I mentioned him before, K4NRD. He's up in the Tallahassee area, and he's on SARnet. I hear him all the time. Okay, which of the following describes a linked repeater network? Okay, a network of repeaters where signals received by one repeater are repeated on all the repeaters. A repeater with more than one receiver. Multiple repeaters with the same owner, or a system of repeaters linked by APRS. Y'all have a guess on this one?
Network of repeaters?
Yep, network of repeaters. The SARnet network that I mentioned earlier is about 40 repeaters. They are not owned by the same people. The Florida Department of Transportation puts them on their towers, but the repeaters are owned by different clubs or different organizations. Yeah, and I Googled what the distance was between Key West to Pensacola. It's 830 miles. So you can drive that 830 miles and almost the whole way be on the same network. You have to change frequencies, but you can still be listening to the same group of folks. Which of the following entities recommends transmit, receive channels, and other parameters for auxiliary or repeater stations? Okay, so this is a group or organization they're talking about. A frequency spectrum manager appointed by the FCC, volunteer frequency coordinator recognized by local amateurs, the FCC regional field office, or the International Telecommunications Union. So the answer on this one is a volunteer frequency coordinator recognized by local amateurs. So there is a frequency coordinator identified specifically for Florida, and that's actually a group, small group of amateur radio operators. And what they do is they make sure, you know, they have a physical map of Florida, and they know where all of the repeaters are and what frequencies they're using. So if you're standing up a repeater, you contact them and they'll make sure that you're not going to be using a frequency that will interfere with someone else. So basically that's all they're doing, is they're just coordinating. And it is a volunteer group. FCC's got no control over it. Okay, and I guess I must have hit next to go on to the next question. Who selects a frequency coordinator? FCC Office of Spectrum Management and Coordination Policy, local chapter of the Office of National Council of Independent Frequency Coordinators, amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations, or the FCC Regional Field Office. And for this one, the answer is C. The frequency coordinators chosen by the local amateurs in the area that's being covered. The FCC has nothing to do with it, so that rules out the first one and the fourth one. And the Office of National Council of Independent Frequency Coordinators, I don't know that that's a real thing. I don't think it is. So it's the actual amateur operators in a local or regional area. A couple of years ago, Florida went through a revolt. They had an amateur frequency coordinator that wouldn't step down, and he wasn't granting frequencies, so they actually had a revolt and kicked the guy out. And the local amateurs can do that. What method of call sign identification is required for a station transmitting phone signals? Now again, phone signals is voice, if you're just transmitting voice. Send the call sign followed by the indicator RPT. Send the call sign using a CW or phone emission. Send the call sign followed by the indicator R. Send the call sign by using only a phone emission. Now, if you were watching my face on a couple of these, you might have ruled a couple of them out. The answer on this one is send the call sign using a CW or phone emission. CW being Morse code, or phone emission being voice. You can actually send out your call sign through Morse code, and that's allowed. Phone emission is the most common. The other two, I don't know where they came from, but just remember CW or phone emission, which is Morse code or voice. And that's the end of section 8. We're going through that kind of quick. Did y'all have any questions or anything you want to talk about on repeaters?
No.
Okay. Then we will move on to emergency. Okay. Which of the following is an accepted practice to get the immediate attention of a net control station when reporting an emergency? Repeat SOS 4 times, followed by the call sign of the reporting station. Press the push to talk button 3 times. Begin your transmission saying priority or emergency, followed by your call sign. Or play a pre-recorded emergency alert tone, followed by your call sign. And y'all have a guess on this one?
3. I mean, C.
C, yeah. So yeah, just begin your call sign by saying priority or emergency. So if I'm calling in, I'm breaking in on something, I'd say priority KX4HD. And they should, if you're calling in on a net, active net where people are talking, they'll back off and let you cut in. SOS doesn't, I think you might have to do that with maritime radio. Push the talk button, you're just creating noise there. And pre-recorded emergency alert tone, that's silly. Yeah, I'm in emergency, let me go get my pre-recorded tone. Nope. Okay, which of the following is accepted practice for an amateur operator who has checked into a net? Okay, and this is actually the simplest. Provided that the frequency is quiet, announce the station call sign and location every 5 minutes. That would be well, no comment. That would be annoying. That's not the right one. Move 5 kilohertz away from the net's frequency and use high power to ask other hams to keep clear of the net frequency. That's kind of another silly one. Remain on frequency without transmitting until asked to do so by the net control station. And that's the actual answer. So basically, when you check into a net, I run a Thursday night net for Aries. And when we request check-ins, people one at a time, sometimes 2 at a time, but usually 1 at a time, they'll call in net control. This is Kilo X-ray 4 Hotel Delta with traffic, which means they're passing messages, or with no traffic, checking in. And then the net control operator will acknowledge you and usually get your location, your name for their log. And then after you do that, you just sit quietly. You don't interrupt, you don't jump in or chime in until the net's over. Then they'll go into some regular conversation, or just talk. You can call back the net control to ask a question, but while everyone's checking in, you just sit quietly. You check in yourself, and then after that you sit quietly. Okay, when do the FCC rules not apply to the operation of an amateur station? When operating a RACI station, when operating under special FEMA controls, when operating under special Aries rules, or never. The FCC rules always apply. Any ideas on that one?
Never.
Never, yes. I was kind of emphasizing that one. Yeah, so the FCC rules always apply. Let me see if I can boost that a little bit.
Are there circumstances where other government agencies try to do that?
If it's a government agency, they can pretty much do what they want to do. But in this case, if you're operating a RACI station or if you're an amateur, the answer is never. If you're an official, like with FEMA, then probably you can do whatever you need to do. It's usually an emergency, something's going on. ARES and RACIs are both two emergency groups, and you're an amateur working for that emergency group, such as after a hurricane or something, and you always have to follow the FCC rules. So there are no exceptions. And if you're an amateur working under FEMA rules, same thing, you would still have to follow the rules. If you were a FEMA official, you might be exempted. But if you're just operating as an amateur operator, you have to follow the FCC rules. Okay, which of the following describes the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Services, RACES? And I put a picture of race cars there. A radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communications. A radio station using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications. An emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization, or all of these are correct. And the answer is, because I actually get confused between, okay, all of them are correct. The first two I thought were right. This one I wasn't sure about, I couldn't remember, but the answer is actually all of the above. So. Okay, now RACES is a civil defense program. ARES is, anybody can jump in. I'm part of ARES in Hillsborough County and in West Coast, Central Florida. I'm just an amateur that decided to volunteer my time and my skills. So, so now I'm part of the ARES network. And it's really just kind of a, in some cases you could describe it as a ragtag group of amateur operators that are willing to help out. The state actually goes through a certification before they'll allow you to work during a hurricane. And I have not met all of those criteria to work in the state. There are 2 or 3 new ones that they just came out with. I've got to go through and get training on. But in Hillsborough County, they're a lot more lax. As long as you get through a couple of the basics, and they'll let you help out. And it's good practice. It's good, you know, learning too. What is the Amateur Radio Emergency Service? ARES is licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duty in the public service. Licensed amateurs who are members of the military and who voluntarily agreed to provide message handling services in the case of an emergency. A training program that provides licensing courses for those interested in obtaining an amateur license to use during emergency, or a training program that certifies amateur operators for membership in the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. Okay, now what it's not is not a training program. So we can rule out C and D right away. So ARES is not a training program. It is a group of licensed amateurs. But B gets ruled out because you don't have to be part of the military. This is just Joe off the street. So the answer is A. Now, Hillsborough County, we lost our coordinator. He passed away this past year. So the group's kind of going through a reorganization. It's not very active right now. Okay, what do ARES and RACES have in common? They represent the 2 largest ham clubs in the United States. Both organizations broadcast road and weather information. Neither may handle emergency traffic supporting public service agencies, or both organizations may provide communications during emergencies. So this one is D. They're not ham clubs. They don't broadcast road and weather information. Although they will do weather during a hurricane. Neither may handle emergency traffic. Well, that's right. Both can handle emergency traffic. So it's D. Okay. Are licensed station control operators ever permitted to operate outside the frequency privileges of their license class? No. Yes, but only when part of a FEMA emergency plan. Yes, but only when part of a RACES emergency plan. Or yes, but only if necessary in situations involving the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. Okay, now this one you gotta be a little careful of, because remember that previous one I said never? The answer to the previous one was never. The answer to this one is yes, but only in necessary situations involving immediate safety of human life or protection of property. If you've got those two, one of those two situations, you can break the rules. They're not going to come down on you. You're calling for emergency. You're in a dead cells area and you've got your ham radio and you're at a traffic accident. You can call for emergency, even if you're not a licensed ham yet. You can also talk outside of your frequencies. So if you had to call out on a general frequency, you could do that in this situation. But they do want to make sure if somebody checks up on you, they're gonna see what the emergency was. Okay. What is meant by the term NCS used in net operation? Nominal control system, net control station, national communication standard, or normal communication syntax. What they're referring to here is a net control station. So again, when I'm working in net, people call me. They don't call me by my call sign because different people work that net every week, but it's easy to remember net control. So I will, when I start the net, I identify myself by my call sign. But if people are just chiming in during the net, they're calling for net control, not having to remember my name or my call sign. So net control station. Okay, what does the term traffic refer to in net operation? It's not this picture. Formal messages exchanged by net stations. The number of stations checking in and out of a net. Operation by mobile or portable stations. Or requests to activate the net by a served agency. And in this one, when they're talking about traffic, they're actually talking about messages that are passed. And when you're passing a message, it's in a very specific and defined format. You actually, if you're, let's say you're working during a hurricane and you're at a shelter and you're having to pass messages back and forth, identifying who's here or, passing some sort of emergency message. We need, so-and-so needs oxygen, we need some oxygen tanks, whatever. It's a formal message. It's written in a very specific format. There's a course on writing the messages because you have to capture specific information. What information is contained in the preamble of a formal traffic message? The email address of the originating station, the address of the intended recipient, the telephone number of the addressee, or the information needed to track the message. Okay, now on this one, you don't have to have an email address, you don't have to have a telephone number. If you're trying to get a message to somebody, but you know their address, you can send a message. In this case, the preamble refers to the information needed to track the message. Okay, and this is actually the top portion of an actual message form. So we've got a number, which is basically a serial number. It could be 01, 02, 03. You want to keep track of the messages that you're tracking. The most common use of this would be after an emergency, something happens, and you're relaying messages because the phone systems are down. We have precedence determines the order in which the traffic is passed. HX, handling instructions, optional. D, station of origin. So whoever first transmitted this, you'll have their call sign. Check, as you're writing out your message, you're putting here the number of words that are in the message. That's used to make sure the message stays consistent or stays accurate. Place of origin, where the message is coming from, time filed, the time that it was started, or the date. Messages, when they're passed, can take a period of time. They could take days to go from the originating station to the final destination. And that's because if you're in an emergency and you're shorthanded, quite often messages don't get priority. You've got priority traffic that you've got to do. So it could be that a message stacks up and then it goes from, you know, me here in Tampa, the only station I might be able to reach maybe in Idaho, if I'm talking on general radio. And then they turn around, they forward it. It could take a time. Usually it doesn't take that long, but sometimes it could. Okay. Which of the following is a characteristic of good traffic handling? Passing the messages exactly as received, making decisions as to whether messages are worthy of relay or delivery, ensuring that any newsworthy messages are relayed to the news media, or all of these choices are correct. Y'all have a guess?
A.
A, yep. You want to, when you're passing messages, you want to pass them exactly as received. It's not your job to determine how worthy or unworthy they are. It's not your job to get anything relayed to the news media. All you're doing is passing traffic. Usually during an emergency, you'll already have an assigned station that you're communicating to. Oh. And, okay. Okay, what should be, and do y'all have any questions on that or anything else I've covered up until now? We're doing good on time.
No.
Okay. What should be done when using voice modes to ensure that voice messages containing unusual words are received correctly? Send the words by voice and Morse code. Speak very loudly into the microphone. Spell the words using a standard phonetic alphabet. Or all of these choices are correct. And any ideas on this one?
Could be all of them.
Nope, it's
No.
phonetic alphabet, yeah. Because you're not required, texts are not required to know Morse code, but you can operate during an emergency, you can volunteer to operate. But you're not required to use Morse code, so by voice is all you need to do. So in this answer, it's saying you're having to use both, and that's not the case. Speaking loudly into the microphone, that could be if you're a quiet talker. I had somebody tell me to move the mic close to my mouth today on a call. Spell the words using phonetic alphabet. So if you've seen any movies or any aircraft stuff, you know, guys on the radio, there are specific words that are defined, but you don't have to use these if you can't remember them. The important thing is to use a word that people will recognize. Like I would identify, if I'm spelling my last name, sometimes on the phone I just say B as in boy. That's not Bravo as in the phonetic alphabet, but people understand boy, or C as in cat, D as in dog, you know. But this is what the standard phonetic alphabet is. And my call sign is Kilo X-ray 4 Hotel Delta, but sometimes I say Kilo X-ray 4 hot dog, because people remember hot dog. What is meant by the term check in reference to formal traffic message, to a formal traffic message? Number of words or word equivalents in the text portion of the message, the value of a money order attached to the message. You're probably seeing my face on that one. A list of stations that have relayed the message, or a box on the message form that indicates that the message was received and or relayed. And what they're referring to by check here is the number of words or word equivalents in the text portion of the message. So this is how, whenever you're, and this is a radiogram, let me blow this up some, if it will blow up. Okay, so here's my message. Had fun in the OJ, I think, contest yesterday. Or is that DJ? I don't know. X meaning a space or next sentence. When is the next one? Question mark. So right here is our check, 14. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So that's a confirmation. If you, do y'all know computer programming at all? Well, I don't know. Parity in computer. Parity's a check bit. Anyway, it's just a check reference that's used to make sure you've got the right number of words. If that number in the message were different, then they'll ask you to repeat it because they'll assume that you have something wrong. And that ends emergency. Y'all have any questions up until now?
No.
Okay. Okay, next one is weak signal propagation. Now this one may take a little bit more. This has got a little bit of understanding that you have to go through with this one. So we'll ask questions on this when you have questions. Why do VHF and UHF radio signals usually travel somewhat farther than the visual line of sight distance between two stations? So VHF and UHF are considered line of sight frequencies. Excuse me, hiccuped. Radio signals move somewhat faster than the speed of light. Radio signals are not blocked by dust particles. The Earth seems less curved to radio waves than to light, or the radio waves are blocked by dust particles. Okay. So in this case, what we're saying is the VHF, UHF signals are traveling a little bit further than the visual line of sight. Usually the visual line of sight is you can go to the curvature of the Earth. But in this case, we're showing that the signal seems to follow the curvature just a little bit. And the reason for that is the Earth seems less curved to radio waves than to light. So the radio waves will bend a little bit around the curve. Not a lot, but they'll bend just a little bit around the curve of the Earth. And in here, in this explanation here, in fact, I think I put this in the notes. The additional distance you will gain in your formulas if you're calculating based on the height of an antenna between two stations will be 15% greater distance for each station, or about 30% total between two stations on either side. So in this case, I've got one station here and I could have the other station here. In later chapters, we're going to get into calculating line of sight and calculating what your distance is based on the height of your antenna. And when we start talking about that, we'll be talking about, you know, you're standing 6 feet tall, somebody else 2 miles away or 5 miles away is 6 feet tall. How far can you transmit based on the line of sight? And then we'll also be covering if you're talking to a repeater that's 1,000 feet in the air, how far away from the repeater can you be? So if you're talking to somebody, well, I'm not going to get into that, but because we'll get into it later, it's in a different chapter. But for this, 15% greater, so it's the signals follow the curvature of the Earth just a little bit. So the Earth seems less curved to radio waves than to light. Do you have any questions on that? Okay. Why might the range of VHF and UHF signals be greater in the winter? Less ionospheric absorption, less absorption by vegetation, less solar activity, or less tropospheric absorption? Okay, and this is one of those questions that's just a, what? And you really we have to get into it just a little bit. And it doesn't take very much, but at first glance, it's confusing. But the answer is vegetation, because during the winter, we have fewer leaves, and leaves and foliage will block our signal or will reduce our distance in our signal. So if you're talking through the forest during the spring or summer when your vegetation's high, you're going to have more objects blocking you. But when the leaves all fall off, you're going to have less objects blocking you. Okay. How might fog and light rain affect range on 10 meters and 6 meters? Now, fog and rain will have effects on signals, but the effects are different on different bands. So here they're specifically asking about 10 meters and 6 meters. So if you know they have an effect on different bands, the question is, are these two of those bands? The answers are fog and rain absorb these wavelength bands. Fog and light rain will have little effect on these bands. Fog and rain will deflect these signals, or fog and rain will increase radio range. Okay, and the answer is going to be fog and light rain will have little effect on these bands. So we'll get into which bands it does affect in just a moment. But fog and rain will absorb some wavelength bands, but not these bands. Fog and rain will deflect these signals. It will deflect some signals, but again, not these. And it won't increase radio range. I don't believe it'll increase radio range on any band. So that's our BS answer in the 4. But yeah, fog and signal have little effect on radio signals below UHF, except for about 220 megahertz, which is the 1.25 meter band. So UHF starts off at 300 megahertz. So fog and rain will have an effect on UHF 300 megahertz and higher, and they're mentioning the 220 megahertz, which is a VHF frequency. It does affect that one too. But the 10 meters and 6 meters are not affected. 50 megahertz and 30 megahertz. Those frequency bands are not affected. All right, wire direct, not via a repeater. UHF signals rarely heard from stations outside of your local coverage area. So this is radio to radio. They are too weak to go very far. FCC regulations prohibit them from going more than 50 miles. UHF signals are usually not reflected by the ionosphere, or UHF signals are absorbed by the ionospheric D layer. And the question on this, or the answer on this one is UHF signals are usually not reflected by the ionosphere. Okay, so as far as being too weak to go very far, you can broadcast UHF and VHF up to, or in this case, UHF. If you put a 1500 watt repeater on there, you can broadcast 1500 watts. So you can pump a lot of power out. FCC regulations prohibit them from going more than 50 miles. That's not true. Think of your TV, UHF TV transmitters. They go far beyond, well, not far, but they'll go over 50 miles. Usually, I think 70 or 80 miles is usually the top range. But again, that depends on how tall the antenna is too, and how the atmosphere is. In this diagram, this is showing that certain signals, and this is showing about 100 megahertz or higher, will pass right through the ionosphere. The way I always remembered it is the higher frequencies tend to be sharper frequencies, so they cut through the ionosphere. They're not reflected. The lower frequencies are duller, so they're more like a knife. Think about a knife. If you throw a knife and it's really sharp, it's going to stick. It's not going to bounce, I guess is what I'm trying to say. If you have a really dull knife, it's not going to stick. It's going to bounce right off. So the lower frequencies are duller. They bounce. The higher frequencies don't bounce. They cut through. And this is what I was just saying. Sharper frequencies, which more likely cut through the ionosphere. Okay. And then, yeah, and this includes microwave too, 70 centimeter frequencies, some 2 meter wavelengths, and longer wavelengths. So yeah, the lower your frequencies, the greater your range due to radio propagation or bounce through the atmosphere. CB radio, by the way, is HF radio. And CB radio is often known to transmit, not reliably, but sometimes you can hear transmissions or you can talk to somebody if the atmosphere is right, over 100 miles, which is huge on 4 watts of power. But that's because those are HF frequencies that they can sometimes bounce. It's not common though, and just because you reach somebody 100 miles away today doesn't mean you'll be able to catch them tomorrow. All right, which of the following effects might cause radio signals to be heard despite obstructions between the transmitting and receiving stations? Knife edge diffraction, Faraday rotation, quantum tunneling, that sounds like something off of sci-fi, or Doppler shift. And on this one, the answer is actually knife edge diffraction. And let me show you the diagram here. So basically what they're saying is if you're transmitting a signal, it can, if it hits the right point, it can actually deflect, or well, in this case, drag is the word that they're using. It can drag and reflect in a slightly different direction. So you can get around that object. Most of the time, if you hit an object, it will block it. But there are some cases where if you're hitting the right point of an object, it can drag or reflect around the object. What mode is responsible for allowing over-the-horizon VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis? So normally with VHF and UHF, you're looking at about 50 miles, but there are some conditions that can extend that. Tropospheric scatter, D-layer refraction, F2 layer refraction, or Faraday rotation. And this is going to be a memorization question, unfortunately. Tropospheric scatter, but that is right here, where you're hitting a certain part of the atmosphere, and it's scattering and extending your range. Whereas normally over line of sight, this would be a repeater network here, like we have it here in Florida. So if I was in Panama City, I hit different repeaters and the signal would bounce around to a distant repeater. But there are some cases where you can get a bounce, and it's not common, but it does happen. Okay. Tropospheric scatter or ducting is an atmospheric occurrence that happens when a stationary high pressure system sits over a large section of the country, and layering can trap warm air, which forms ducts that refract VHF and UHF signals beyond the line of sight. So that is going to be one of your memorization questions, unless you're good with probably weather. Okay, what causes tropospheric ducting? Discharges of lightning during electrical storms, sunspots and solar flares, updrafts from hurricanes and tornadoes, or temperature inversions in the atmosphere. And the answer on this one is D, temperature inversions in the atmosphere. So this is a diagram. Actually, let me bring up the explanation. Okay. So here we've got a layer of cold air, we've got a layer of warm air, and we've got a layer of cool air. So this warm air layer acts kind of like an air duct would, and it will allow a certain level of bouncing to occur. Okay, weak signal propagation. What weather condition would decrease range at microwave frequencies? So microwave frequencies are UHF and above, so they're very high frequencies. And we did touch on this earlier when we were talking about the 6 and 10 meter bands. So the conditions options are high winds, low barometric pressure, precipitation, or colder temperatures. Now, if you remember before, we were talking about fog and light rain. So that's going to be what will affect microwave frequencies. And microwave frequencies start off in the upper UHF band and go up from there. Let's see, we have UHF, and then I can't remember the short, I think the first session I touched on it. There's something above UHF, and that includes microwave frequencies as well. Okay, what is the characteristic of VHF signals received via aurora reflection? Signals from a distance of 10,000 or more miles are common. The signals exhibit rapid fluctuations of strength and often sound distorted. These types of signals occur only during winter nighttime hours, or these types of signals are generally strongest when your antenna is aimed west. Okay, so there are a couple of these we can rule out pretty quick. The signals from distances of 10,000 or more miles are common. That doesn't have anything to do with auroras. You can do long signals, but that's got nothing to do with auroral reflections. These types of signals occur only during winter nighttime hours. I don't know. That's not the answer. There are, when you're talking with HF, there are times when you get a lot better signal either during the day or at night. So time of the day can have a influence on your range, but not auroral reflections. And then these types of signals are generally strongest when your antenna is aimed west. No, that's silly. Okay. VHF frequencies between 30 megahertz and 300 megahertz and include the ham bands of 1.25 meters and 2 meters and 6 meters. These are line of sight frequencies which do not generally bounce through the atmosphere like HF frequencies. And then one unusual exception is the auroral reflection, which will allow the 2-meter frequencies to bounce off of the auroral curtain of the northern lights. Do you know what causes the northern lights? Just footnote.
I can't remember now.
It's the solar flares coming in, or solar activity coming in from the sun. Have y'all ever heard of the Carrington Event? I don't know if you've ever studied EMP.
I've heard of it.
Or coronal mass ejections. The Carrington Event was something that occurred in 1859.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a massive ejection from the sun, natural event, and it did a lot of weird things to us. If it occurred today, it would knock out the grid. But it did the ejections coming from the sun were so massive. They normally the northern lights are very far up north because that's the area that they commonly hit. But they were so strong during the Carrington Event that the northern lights could be seen in the Caribbean, and they were so bright that farmers were getting up at 2 in the morning thinking it was 5 or 6 in the morning because they could see the light, so much light out. Okay, what band is best suited for communicating via meteor scouter? So it's actually possible to bounce signals off meteors, like during a meteor shower. And 6 meters is the answer for this one. I could not even remember it myself until I saw it here. So that is something that you really have to plan for. Trying to bounce a signal off a meteor. That's part of the reason why they call ham radio an art, because there's some things that you just really have to plan for. 6 meters is a lower frequency for hams. In the VHF range, you can travel further. With the better distance characteristic coupled with the ability to transmit up to 1500 watts, in this band, with your license, it is possible to bounce signals during a meteor shower or even from the moon. I misspelled meteor there. Got to fix that. All right. Which part of the atmosphere enables the propagation of radio signals around the world? Now, this is something that will come up on the test time and time and time again. Different questions always talk about it. The 4 options are the stratosphere, the troposphere, the ionosphere, or the magnetosphere. And our answer on this one is the ionosphere. Okay. And when they're talking about radio signals, they're talking about HF radio signals. This is what you get your general license for, because you can get that ionospheric bounce and you can go great distances. You can go well around the curvature of the Earth. Whereas if we were talking about UHF, VHF, you'd only be going, a fraction of that. Okay. So ionosphere is a answer or a word that you'll be hearing a lot of. Oh, and then this is saying different frequencies will bounce at different layers at different times of the day and under different weather conditions. So generally your HF bounces, but the different frequencies bounce differently. So just because you're getting good bounce on one frequency at one time of the day doesn't mean you'll get good bounce with something else. On which HF bands does a technician class operator have phone privileges? And they're talking about voice privileges. Answers are none, 10 meters only, 80 meters, 40 meters, 15 and 10 meters, or 30 meters only. Do y'all know what the answer is to this one?
10 meter.
10 meters, yeah. Yeah, so you do have limited permissions on 10 meters. C, you can rule out right away. A, you can rule out if you remember that you have limited privileges. And 10 fingers. Okay. Which of the following is an advantage of HF versus VHF in higher frequencies? HF antennas are generally smaller. HF accommodates wider bandwidth signals. Long distance ionospheric propagation is far more common on HF, or there's less atmospheric interference or static on HF. Okay. And the answer on this one, we talked about ionospheric propagation, which is bounce. It's far more common in HF. So again, this is why you want to get your general license. Is so that if you really want to be able to talk distances, this is what you need, is your general license for your HF. The VHF and UHF are more likely they're sharper, they're going to cut through the ionosphere, keep on going into space. Okay, and this is again saying frequencies above 100 megahertz usually will not propagate through the atmosphere. God, another spelling error. Okay, which of the following HF bands have frequencies available to the technician class operator for RTTY and data transmission? So we're talking about HF bands. So HF's going to be 10 meters or higher. So A could be a possibility. Actually, all of these could be a possibility. And I honestly don't remember the answer to this one. This one's 10 meters. So there'll be a theory, not a theory, but a pattern here where they're talking about 10 meters a lot. Yeah, and 10 meters is the only HF band you'll have access to as a technician. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? A government transmitter making the amateur radio band edges. A marking, I'm sorry, that didn't make sense. Government transmitter marking the amateur radio band edges. A bulletin set by the FCC to announce a national emergency. An amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities, or a continuous transmission of weather information authorized in the amateur bands by the National Weather Service. So there's actually only one good answer on this one. Government transmitter marking the amateur radio band edges, that doesn't exist. Bulletin set by the FCC to announce a national emergency. They don't use the amateur bands for that. A continuous transmission of weather information. No, that would be broadcasting, and that's not allowed. Not on the amateur bands. So the only proper answer is an amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation. Beacons will be set up in different parts of the country or world actually, and they just continuously broadcast. So if you're on usually a general license and you're on HF radio, well, actually you can listen in even without a license. You just can't transmit. So if you have an HF radio and you know the frequency of a beacon in France, you can tune in to that frequency, and then you may have to play with your antenna to see if you can receive that signal. And it'll just be a beep, something, but it's just a continuous signal. Okay, what is generally the best time for long distance 10-meter band propagation via the F layer of the atmosphere? From dawn to shortly after sunset during periods of high sunspot activity? From shortly after sunset to dawn during periods of high sunspot activity? From dawn to shortly after sunset during periods of low sunspot activity? Or from shortly after sunset to dawn during periods of low sunspot activity? These answers are so similar. They're, and I don't remember the answer myself. From dawn till shortly after sunset during periods of high sunspot activity. So high sunspot activity increases your ability to transmit. So in this case, you're talking about propagation. So it basically increases your range. We happen to be in a period of low sunspot activity right now. But so high sunspot activity allows better propagation. this is going to take some memorization, but they're talking about during the daylight. And of course, if they're talking about during the daylight, at night, you're not going to get the effects of that sunspot activity. You're on the wrong side of the Earth for that. So that's why they're talking about from during the day, during periods of high sunspot activity. And they were talking about 10 meter back there too. All right, which of the following results from the fact that skip signals refract from the ionosphere are elliptically polarized? Okay, digital modes are unusable. Either vertically or horizontally polarized antennas may be used for transmission or reception. FM voice is unusable, or both transmitting and receiving antennas must be of the same polarization. Okay, and let me explain polarization. Okay, the signals go out from the antenna based on the length of the antenna. So they don't go out the top, they go out the sides of the antenna. So if you've got a 2 meter antenna, your radio waves are going to go out the sides of that 2 meter antenna. So if that antenna is sticking straight up, your signals are going to go outward. If you can, you know, you can see my hands. So if your antenna is going up, your radio signals are going to go out. If your antenna is horizontal, your radio signals are going to go this way. They're going to go up and down. So in this case, let's see. Skip signals refracted from the atmosphere are electrically polarized. I guess in this case, and I'm not good with this because I have not done a lot of HF work myself. So I'm not really trying to bounce signals, so I haven't played with it. But in this case, they're saying it doesn't matter. If you're using a HF antenna, for VHF and UHF antennas, usually your antennas go straight up. For HF antennas, they usually are parallel to the ground because you're going to try and get that signal up into the atmosphere for bounce, or you want your signal to come down, hit the earth, and then reflect back up. So. Okay, weak signal propagation. Which of the following results from the fact that skip signals refracted from the ionosphere? Oh, that's the same. I'm sorry. Oh, and on this one, if you're, I put this in the notes. There's a PDF file here. And I think this PDF goes a little bit better into the explanation. Okay. Okay, so radio wave polarization. So this gets a lot more technical, maybe more technical than you want to get into. Yeah, this is more technical than I'm going to get into tonight. But if you really want to know more about it, wow, this really gets into it, doesn't it? Okay. All right, let me go on to the next question. Which of the following propagation types is most commonly associated with occasional strong over-the-horizon signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands? Backscatter, sporadic E, D-layer absorption, or gray line propagation? And I think this was, yeah, sporadic E. Okay, so this is where you're getting, let's see, let me get into the answer here. Okay, phenomenon known as sporadic E propagation. Let's see. Can allow propagation of these bands up to 1,000 miles away, with the more rare occurrences in the 2 meter band and the more common occurrence is in the 10-meter band. The longer the wavelength, lower the frequency, the better the propagation. So that's why they're saying 10 meters is more likely to get propagation through sporadic propagation. All right, so in this case, we've got the signals going up into the atmosphere and bouncing around. Okay, skip zone. So they're referring to sometimes, depending on the frequency, sometimes you're going to be able to communicate a great distance where somebody near you won't be able to hear you. During Hurricane Michael, up in Jackson County, they lost all their phones, they lost all their radios. They brought up a general, an HF radio station, and they could not communicate with anybody nearby, but they were able to bounce the signal to Jacksonville. So they could not get communications to Tallahassee, but they were able to skip over Tallahassee, reach someone in Jacksonville, and the people in Jacksonville were turning around, getting on the phone and relaying the information to them. So that's what they're referring to by skip zone here. Sometimes you can get greater distance, but not communicate with somebody near you. Okay, which of the following bands may provide long distance communications during the peak of the sunspot activity? Okay, 6 or 10 meters, 23 centimeters, 70 centimeters, or 1.25 meters, or all of these choices are correct. Now this one, I believe that's going to be, yep, 6 or 10 meters. So this gets back into the longer the wavelength, the better we're going to get distance. And here they're talking about during peak of sunspot activity. So they're assuming bouncing from the activity from the sunspots coming down. Now this solar cycle, this diagram was done in, it says you were here, so this was done back in 2015. We're actually, and that was near the peak of a solar cycle. But here we're down here in 2020. So we're at just coming out of a low of the solar cycle. Okay. Yeah, and again, propagation and long distance communication works on lower frequencies and longer wavelengths, which is 6 to 10 meters for us as technicians. What property of a radio wave is used to describe its polarization? The orientation of the electric field, the orientation of the magnetic field, the ratio of the energy in the magnetic field to the energy in the electric field, or the ratio of velocity to the wavelength. And I believe it's B, or am I right? No, I'm wrong. I remember it was orientation. And that's back when I was describing if the antenna is oriented up and down, your signals are going to go out. If your antenna is horizontal, your signals are going to go up and down. Okay, polarization of radio wave is defined by the orientation of the electric field always. Okay, magnetic field is the magnetic field of a radio wave occurs at right angles to the electric field. Okay. All right, last question for tonight. Which of the following is a likely cause of irregular fading of signals received by ionospheric reflection? Frequency shift due to Faraday rotation, interference from thunderstorms, random combining of signals arriving via different paths, or intermodulation distortion. Now I'll explain this one to you because it's once you understand it, what they're talking about here, sometimes you're getting a strong signal, sometimes you're getting a weak signal. What's happening is during your communication, during your conversation with someone, the atmosphere, the characteristics of the atmosphere are changing. So your reflection point is going to change. So as your reflection points change, your signal strength or the amount of interference you get is going to vary or is going to change. And what they're talking about is a regular fading of signals. So basically your signal is getting stronger or weaker during your conversation. So sometimes reflection can also get you an echo. So you're listening to somebody and it sounds like an echo coming through, and that's because you're receiving the same conversation from two different paths because of bounce, signal bounce. So that can occur also. Do y'all have any questions? Anything you want to talk about?
I don't.
Okay. All right, next week, we will definitely not do two. I mean, we will definitely not do more than two. We'll try and tackle 12 and 13. That'll be 53 questions. We can probably do that, I think. There are a couple, when we do 15, there are a couple sections that are very large. So we'll do some of these, probably the only section those nights. And because of how these are lining up, we may at some point get to run where we're only getting halfway through a section. We've been fortunate enough, so far we've been able to pretty much finish complete sections, but that may change. I think next week we can get through these two. So a couple of weeks that'll change. All right, well, anything else you want to talk about, or before we part ways?
I don't think so. This stuff's a little bit harder because it doesn't make sense. So.
Yeah. Well,
to memorize it and
yeah, it's gonna be a lot of memorizing.
Yeah, some of this is, I'll be honest, is pure memorization. My schedule this week has changed. I'm working from home, and they were not able to give me a computer to work on a secured network. So basically, I'm sitting around answering phone calls and trying to go by memory on stuff, which means I'm not getting a lot of work done. So if you need during the day, if you want to chime in, you know, catch me on the Preham channel, I'm available. So all week available on Preham. If there's anything y'all want to talk about, if I don't know the answer, I'll try and dig it up and talk through it with you. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
All right.
We'll
Thank
talk to you.
you.
You're welcome. I'll talk to y'all soon.
Okay.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Have a good night.
Hey,
You
good
too.
night.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.